Hey, friends. Welcome to Gray Roots Podcast. This is Alecia Warneke, and I have Kari Oakley-Miller and Kathy Eggers with me this morning. How are y'all doing?
Good morning. Doing
Good
well.
morning.
Good morning. Good morning. It is a little bit rainy here where we are. Not super fond of that. Better to be raining than to be dead, right?
Yeah. Yes, that is the way to get us
I
started,
mean,
Alicia.
unless you're going to see Jesus. And that is
Oh,
what we are going
hey.
to be talking about today.
Yeah.
Great
Okay?
segue.
Right.
Good segue. I'm just going to roll right into that. Our new series, if y'all listened last week, it is called It's Complicated. And one of the things that we think is super complicated is religion and spirituality and people's personal beliefs and their practices and the impacts that this has not only on the family that you're in, if you have those differences with your spouse, but also with the in-laws. If you are the parents, the impact that has on your kids and their new family and vice versa. So I am going to start out with a little story so y'all know a little bit about me. And then we'll kind of dive in with some questions. So I grew up. I didn't start going to church really until I was about 9. My mom and I had left, moved in with my grandparents, and they all went to a Presbyterian church. And so I started going along with them. My mom's brother who lived in the town, their whole, they went, my cousins went. I didn't really have any experience with church or God or anything like that before that. And that was how I was raised. I was super bored when I had to sit in the adult services. I used to love to go into the baby room. That was my favorite place to be, to help in the nursery. And in Alicia fashion, much to my mother's chagrin, if I was made to sit in the big church area, I would be obnoxious as possible. I would start chewing gum. I'd snap my gum. I'd groan. I'd shift. I'd wiggle in my seat. Kathy's shaking her head like,
Yeah.
Yep, I bet you did. I bet you did. Just be glad y'all weren't my mom, right?
That's normal, though. I see nothing. That's you're being a kid. You're being a kid.
I was being a kid, and I was intentionally doing that because I was gonna show my mom, like, I'll show you. You want to make me sit here and listen to this stuff that doesn't have anything to do with me? So
Smart kid.
as I got older, I developed my own faith. I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior, and He is to this day. Now, fast forward about maybe another 9, 10, 8, 7 years, and I met my husband, Jeff. He grew up in a very Catholic family. The town in St. Louis where we grew up is a very Catholic town. It's name of the town is Florissant. You were either French Catholic or you were German Catholic. Well, his last name was Warneke, so he was German Catholic. And it just goes back from when the town was settled. Being Catholic in his family was more of something they just were. It wasn't necessarily about a relationship with God. And at least from his perspective, that was what he saw. His parents would have the kids go to church. They would drop them off. They went to Catholic school because grandma and grandpa paid for it. And so that was his experience. So when I met him, he was a Catholic boy, and I was basically a Protestant girl. He didn't really understand why I went to church every Sunday. And like, more importantly for me, I went to youth group every Sunday night. That was kind of my place. I really enjoyed going to youth group. So if he wanted to see me on Sunday night, he had to come to youth group with me. And that's just kind of how we started. But I will say, and we have had to have many conversations about it, that was difficult to navigate at first, because even though they're both based on Christian beliefs about Jesus, there were some very different theologies, very different practices and things between the Protestant church and the Catholic church. Not only that, I am the only Protestant in their family. Like, he was the only person that brought a Protestant girl home. That was kind of like the black sheep. From like, are you going to have a Catholic wedding? you have to have a Catholic wedding if you're Catholic. I didn't have to have one because I wasn't Catholic. So I know that like just put his mom in a tizzy. Oh, what about the baby? The baby's going to be, baptized and christened as a baby in the Catholic Church. And like, well, no, because I'm not Catholic. So there began all of this stuff, all of these kind of struggles with the spiritual differences that were going on just with how we were raised and then how we came together as a couple. And that caused a lot of tension. Now, my mother-in-law never really talked to me about her struggle with that, but I know she was, because especially before we were going to get married, she was pushing and pushing and pushing to have a priest there to officiate, or at least stand in with another officiant, so that our marriage would be legitimate in the eyes of the Catholic Church. So when we didn't do, I'm like, that's fine. I don't mind having a priest there, but we went to talk to a priest and said, yeah, well, it's going to be, this much money to have somebody there. And you're going to have to go to these classes. And the classes are, you could go to these classes for 9 months, like once a week for 9 months, probably similar to premarital counseling. But that was a deal breaker because I was already pregnant, y'all. So I was getting married in 2 months. If you couldn't cram all that into 2 months, then that was not an option. So those were just some of the things that came up with us coming together as a couple and having two different religious backgrounds.
How is that now?
Raised. It's interesting. It is. So Jeff dug into Catholicism a little bit more, and he decided that he was more closely aligned with Protestant beliefs. And honestly, like, I wouldn't even say I'm Presbyterian anymore. That's how I was raised. I tell people I'm a follower of Jesus, and I do the best I can to follow him every day. And sometimes it's pretty ugly. As far as denominations, because of the whole Presbyterian thing, and then we had friends that were Methodist, and there was just all of this stuff like, oh, well, you do that and you can. Like, listen, if Jesus said that, if he modeled it, then it's okay for me to do. If he told me, hey, you need to do this, then I'm going to follow and do that. If he didn't say it, then I'm going to leave any judgment there. If you want to do that, that's fine. But I am doing my best to just follow what his example was. So I tend to not relate or resonate with any type of denomination. And Jeff is the same way. So now we're very much on the same page with things.
So with my question, though, what is that relationship like with his family, who I am assuming is still very Catholic? Did that end up, obviously, was that a problem, or has that?
That's a great question, because so his family had 4 kids. He has 2 older brothers, then him, and then a younger sister. And so his oldest brother is very much Catholic and true to the way that he was raised. And he and his brother, there's some disagreement on that part. I think they've done a really good job, both of them, of saying, hey, here's why I believe this. Here's why I practice this. And coming together and saying, like, hey, the bottom line is we both love Jesus, and he is both of our Lord and Saviors. That's what we have in common. So they focus on that. And they will talk about different, the differences every once in a while when they get together. The second brother, I don't think really identifies as being Catholic anymore. They don't really go to church. They're not kind of in a, practicing any type of spiritual or religious faith. And his younger sister, she doesn't like the tension of all of that. So she kind of steers away from all of religion also. She loves God, but anything that has to do with you should be doing this or you should be doing that and you have to do this, she's not about it. She'll like back it up and leave the room.
Interesting.
So then that brings the, Thanksgiving table, right? Like, so what don't you talk about at Thanksgiving? Politics, which we talked about last week, and religion, which we're talking about this week. So those are some examples of spiritual differences that I have. Do y'all have any examples of spiritual differences that you've experienced either, within your marriage, your in-laws, siblings even, that kind of blew my mind that like, hey, kids grow up and they don't always all believe the way that they were raised, right? Just because you raise them a certain way doesn't mean that they're gonna, follow in that path.
Yeah,
Kathy?
I have a couple examples, but I'll just stick with, so when Andy and I were getting together, he was Pentecostal. He was going to a Pentecostal church, and I have never been in one. I've heard stories, but here's this handsome guy. So, and I went, and I didn't know what to do. It was so different than anything that I've ever experienced before. And so those were just conversations that he and I had, like, why do you believe that? And so it caused me to question what I was doing, going to Grace and just going to a church, and then why he was going to what he was doing. So it was good because it was good conversation about, why do you believe this? Well, why, and I had questions. I didn't know anything about the Pentecostal church. So it caused me to kind of open my mind a little bit and be more open-minded to a different denomination that I'd never experienced before. So it was a good thing. And we have since, like you said, Alecia, come to a common ground of, what, we're just followers of Jesus. It's not this or that or do's or don'ts. It's just, what does he say? And he says to love people. And so that's where the common ground that we've come to.
So Kari, for those listeners that we have out there that are not maybe familiar with Pentecostal churches and what that term means, can you describe a little bit about what was different for you with that experience that you hadn't experienced before? Like, what kind of designates a Pentecostal church?
Just way more charismatic than any church I'd ever been in. Running up and down the aisles, people literally falling on the floor, just dancing in the aisles again, and hands raised, and then speaking in tongues, which I was like, I don't know what they're saying. I can't understand what they're saying. Like, what is happening here? So just very much outgoing. The Spirit is moving, and people aren't afraid to express whatever that means for them. So the people falling on the floor was like, whoa. And one time I brought my kids with me, and they had never experienced that, and they were scared. So it caused us to, why is this? What are they doing? It was a good conversation.
Yeah. How about you, Kathy?
Yeah, similar. When Jeff and I met, Jeff did not attend church, so that was a huge question for me. Definitely being a person of faith, what was his faith story? His faith story was real different from mine. He grew up in New Zealand. So culturally, just how church is approached was so different. He grew up Lutheran, went to the Lutheran church, but when he moved to the United States, his first wife, who passed away, she was not a follower of Christ. And so they just didn't go to church. And he just didn't either. He had faith, but it wasn't something that he practiced going to church. And so we had a conversation about that. And I remember the first time he and I attended church together, it was so emotional for him because he had just not been in that space in so long. And it was so beautiful to witness. And my younger self would have dismissed him as a possible partner because of his faith story. I wasn't mature enough to understand that someone's faith story could look different and they still could be compatible with me. And I was thankful that as an older person meeting him in my fees, that I was able to have those tough conversations and ask questions and recognize that our faith stories don't have to look the same and we don't have to be of the same denomination. Just what you said, Kari, is that that's what we do in our home too. And you said it too, Alecia. We focus on Jesus, and that is the way we try to live as a couple. And our faith story as a couple is that we just try to follow the example of Jesus. It doesn't fit in a beautiful box like I thought it all had to in my 20s and 30s, but I think it's a beautiful way to live. And I think that we minister together as a couple in powerful ways, even if it doesn't fit in a box.
What do you think it is about religious, spiritual differences that is like such a sticky subject for people? Why do you think it's so emotionally charged?
I think it's because it's abstract and people want to make it so concrete. Like faith is abstract, right? It's hope in the things that we can't see. But I think so many people, their logical brain can't rationalize that. And so they've got to create a story. And that narrative is whatever their version of their theology is. And the way that I say, I'm like, listen, there are so many people out there that are so much smarter than me, and they have studied the Bible and every book that goes along with the Bible, and they still can't agree on what the real story is. And I think that's difficult, because then I think pride comes in and we're convinced that our version is correct. Our version of faith is correct. And so we've been finally convinced of that. So you should be convinced that our version is correct. I mean, for me, that's what I think.
Exactly. Yeah. And then also to add to that is again, just like last week when we talked about politics, it's so personal. Everybody's journey is different, and it's so personal. And so for somebody to come and say, well, that's not valid, or that's not, I'm not going to validate that, or you're wrong, is just like, oh, you're attacking me personally, and trying to change my views of, you're saying that what my experience was, because we all have different experiences with religion, right? And Andy Stanley's very good at this. He said, if I would walk in your shoes, I wouldn't want to come to church either. I wouldn't have faith either.
Well, listen, and nothing magnifies that more than when you are facing someone you love is facing death. Nothing magnified someone's beliefs more than when Joshua was dying, and the emails and the texts I got from people's own beliefs of, he needs to confess this sin and he won't die. Have you considered taking him to this revival and he won't die? You need to load him up in the car right now so he won't die. The pressure that I received from so many well-meaning people putting their faith into a blasting text to me in Joshua's final days blew my mind. And even now, I'll be honest, when I see someone say, God answered my prayer, I prayed that my cancer would be gone, or I prayed that my son or spouse wouldn't die. And I'm like, hey, now, I prayed that my son wouldn't die, and he freaking died. So it's personal. Yeah. Faith is personal, and I get fired up if you can't tell. I love Jesus. I don't question God. I don't. God, that was his decision. But boy, I do get fired up when people try to tell me what God's plans were. That I get fired up with.
Yes. Right? Yeah. That's what I get fired up when people judge other people, because when I was going to church for the first time and I had my sin sitting right on my hip, I'm carrying him with me and everybody knows, and I was getting judged in the church. It was like, ooh, what are you doing behind the scenes? Like, I get fired up too.
I think that's our older, wiser self. Sorry, Alecia. I think it's our older, wiser selves that can sit through that. And that's why we're talking about this today, because if you're listening to this and you're one of the younger ones who feel so passionate, like, don't you remember in your 20s and your 30s, you thought you knew faith? Like, y'all know, girl, I was the most judgmental at a phase of my life, and I thought I had faith figured out, and I would tell everyone I had it figured out. And listen, if you're listening to this in your 20s and 30s and you think you have faith figured out, I have a little bit of wisdom. You don't. You just don't.
Yeah.
And I say that with love, because you don't. And we're going to figure it out when we take our last breath, and we're going to go, look at that. I didn't have it figured it out. And the older I get, the more I know I don't have it figured out. And I think that's the wisdom. I think that's the wisdom that we're sitting here with today. Sorry to interrupt you, Alecia.
No. I was just kind of echoing Kari's feelings. I grew up in this Presbyterian Protestant church, and I went to church every Sunday. I was a very good girl. I loved Jesus. But when I got pregnant, and then Jeff and I started going to church together, and even kind of before that, when he would come to church, the church that I went to, like, you dressed up. The men were in suits, the ladies were in dresses, you wore, heels and like the whole thing. Well, Jeff didn't really own any clothes like that because he never had a reason to put them on.
And he was 17,
right?
He was a baby, right?
My cousins that went, they absolutely, like, you had it was your Sunday best that you wore.
Right.
And so, when we started going together and he was not dressed, and he's like, no, I don't want to go. Like, people would look at him funny. I didn't believe him at first. Then, like, I started paying attention. After we had Andrew and we started going together, people looked, I definitely had that scarlet letter on the front of my shirt, but that's people being imperfect people. That's one of the reasons that I'm not a huge fan of denominations and religion, quote unquote. I am a big fan of Jesus because Jesus loves perfectly. And I think, Kari, you are right. It's the thing that makes it so prickly is it feels like we're getting judged by people who don't believe the same as we do, right? And that could be differences in the way that they practice their faith. It could actually be differences in, what the belief is, and how they carry that out. And it can be uncomfortable, I think. Like you were talking about going to the Pentecostal church. I imagine that was probably very uncomfortable for you to be in that environment when you weren't brought up that way. You weren't accustomed to it. So let's talk about, we're kind of sitting here on the Jesus part of things, the Christian side. What about family members who don't believe in Jesus or God at all? Their belief is that they don't know if there's a God. There might be, there might not be, agnostic or atheist, and they come into your family. How do we navigate that with that in-law relationship and still keep the relationship intact?
Yeah.
I've
So
got that too.
here, we have that too. And Andy and I have to make sure that we agree on how we handle this, and it's not in the beginning because they were all under our house. Here's what we do as a family. We're going to church. This is what we do. But now that, most everybody is out, it's up to them to decide how they want to do this. And I think that's normal anyway in these is to navigate your faith, right? You're questioning, what am I doing just because I did this as a family and my parents said I had to, but what do I actually believe? So I think it's normal, and allowing them to do that, allowing them that space to figure it out for themselves. And so, if some of them are here for dinner, we pray. We will pray. Just because you're not a believer, or we're going to pray. This is just what we do.
In your house, that's what you do.
In our house. Yeah. And so for some of them, allowing them that space to figure it out for themselves, but also not to be afraid for me to have my own faith too. Not to be afraid of offending somebody, but it's not, oh, you're going to church. I can't believe you don't go to church. Because again, and let me just wrap up real quick. Again, it's their own experiences. Like Carly, and she's going to listen to this, they don't go to church. And, she's probably, and I think she said it, just wrestling with the fact that how can I trust a God who took my dad and left kids to, that is legit. Yeah. And so that's something she's going to have to wrestle with. And she is wrestling with that. And Benjo's grew up in the church, and his family did some certain things that he's questioning faith. And that's his own journey. Trusting that God is bigger and he sees them when we'll meet them where they're at, and loving people. Just love people where they're at.
Yeah, I just, I remember when Jeff and I got married, his two boys, to my knowledge, very anti-faith. I came in to his home. We were getting ready to actually place it on the market, and it needed some artwork. Well, I had a lot of scripture artwork at that time, so I threw some up on the wall, not even thinking. Boy, did I hit a nerve with his boys. They walked in and saw scripture, and their mother hated God, to my knowledge. That's what I was told. So, and then I come in and put scripture on the wall was like so unkind of me. So not being sensitive to where those boys are. And so now, they know that I have faith. They know that I love Jesus, but I am real careful not to shove it down their face, or down their throat. I think, like we said last week in the politics talk, it's real similar. Our actions, how we behave, needs to be the thing that leads the conversation, not our words, just how we treat people, that they would pause and say, what is different? Why is she that way? I hope that someone says that if they're around me long enough. I hope they're questioning, why am I a little more kind than most people? I hope I am, not always. Why do I love like a fool? It's all because of God. For me, it is. It is the thing. It is the thing that drives me. But I have to recognize that's not what's driving them. And I think so often as parents, we think we can control our children and our stepchildren, and we really can't. I think our job is to try to walk it as much as we can, imperfectly, own it when we're imperfect, but just try to walk it and let it speak for itself and love them anyway. I just can't, I'm blown away. If I'm being honest right now, I am blown away by parents who walk away from their children because of their children's choices. I will never understand that. I'll never understand it.
Yeah.
I've got children I've made all kinds of choices, but I've got children too who've made choices I wouldn't make, but they're still my children. So that's a side note, but I think it's important because religion is one of those things that pushes people away from one another and it causes divide in families. Y'all, stop letting it cause divide in your family. Be bigger than that. Jesus would not want that. He would not want the divide. I just have a hard time believing that.
Yeah. And the judgment you're talking about, like judging people for behaving or not behaving a certain way and then thinking that we're better because we're, that I think that is a huge problem within the church. And so then kids base their faith and think that that is who God is.
Right.
And that is not who God is.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
This one's getting me fired up. I'm going to need to take a deep breath.
Good.
Sorry.
So what if we flip that one upside down? What about from the perspective, and we are all faith-based women. What about the listeners out there, the people out there that are not faith-based? And maybe it's a daughter-in-law and they have a mother-in-law that keeps trying to talk to them about Jesus and maybe take their kids to church. And I mean, I don't know. Things like that where it's kind of in their face. What are some tools that we can give those moms to kind of launch a conversation? Ultimately, I think that's what needs to happen, is having a conversation, right? Otherwise, it just gets ugly fast. So what are some tools that we can give them?
DM me for my phone number and give your mother-in-law my phone number. I'll be happy to have a conversation with her.
There we go. How do they manage that? I don't want to speak for anyone, but in my mind, it seems the mother-in-law is doing that out of love.
That's what I was thinking.
And also she probably still wants to control things because it's hard for us to not do that. Mm-hmm. And she thinks that's what's best because that's what she knows. But that's not where that daughter-in-law is, and maybe not how that daughter-in-law wants to even raise her children. So what can that daughter-in-law do other than just stuff it, right? You just stuff it on that, because then we have the whole resentfulness. I'm like, oh, my mother-in-law.
It's funny, we always talk about the memes. I think I say this every week, but reels. Yesterday on Instagram, a reel popped up, and it's some young girl, and she's talking about that it's so much easier not having to deal with the problems of the mother-in-law because she's just decided not to have a relationship. Is this what you shared, Kari?
Yeah.
Is this the one you shared? Yeah, that's what it was. Mm-hmm. You had shared this. And, shouldn't have to have a relationship with this woman anymore because that's just they don't talk about it because her son's like, we got to go along with it because that's just my mom. We don't talk about it. And she's like, hey, you know what? For me, you're right. I don't have to talk about it because I'm not going to have a relationship with her. And I was like, dang. But I get that.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard to be around people who are, whatever their thing is at you all the time. And I can imagine, listen, someone, if they're hating on God, there's a reason. Let's be honest. There is something that they've experienced that represents God that is hurt in their life. Mm-hmm. And so you coming at them, poking that pain, it's never going to end with someone going, oh, you're right. You're right. I was so hurt by this, but you're right. I'm going to today change my mind and love Jesus. Mm-hmm. Not going to happen. And so for me, I would say it is a time, if you're the adult, not the mother-in-law or the mother, but you're the young mom who doesn't want her child to go to church. I think you do have to say, hey, this is hard for me. You have to be vulnerable enough to say, this is hard for me. I understand that you disagree with this and you really want to take our daughter to church. But for me right now, it's going to be a no. And I can imagine, I've not had that conversation, but I can imagine that's really tough to have. And so I feel for you if you're listening to this and you need to have that conversation. But I would also say, I beg of you, if you're the older person listening to this, you're the in-law, mother-in-law, the mother, respect that. If you ever want to show Jesus to her, you start by respecting that.
Yeah.
Those are my thoughts on it.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, his 2 commandments, love God and love people.
Yeah.
Your daughter-in-law is people. What does
Yeah.
love look like?
I like how you said talk about the daughter-in-law, like maybe even take it a step further is to investigate that a little bit in your own story. Like, why are you, just to figure out who you are as a person and in your relationship with God, like what happened? Maybe get some therapy around it. Like, what happened and it's fine. It's fine not to go to church, but there must have been something that happened. Some wounds.
But it's hard. I'm sitting here saying this, and I've not even had conversations with the Eggers boys about that. I've never asked them why they have this, why they're so turned off by God.
Hey, Carly,
I have no idea.
She's probably going to listen to this, and we haven't talked about it. We just don't talk about it.
Right. I mean,
Carly, you can come talk to me about it.
Carly,
I'm a neutral party. Come talk to me, Carly.
Yeah.
I love on you, girl.
But you know what, Carly? I get that. I mean, to you specifically listening, sweet girl, I get that, because those are some of the same feelings I have. And we see you and we love you, have loved you your whole little life. And now that you're a grown mama is beautiful. So it makes me teary thinking about it. And I think it's easier said than done, because we're sitting here and it's like anything. It's easy for us to say, be vulnerable enough to have that conversation. And it's interesting, every time we record a podcast, I debrief with Jeff. And I said yesterday about I call them my Eggers boys, but, those boys don't like me very much. If they're listening, they'll be honest about that. I'm so different from their mom, and I get that. And I wish it were different. And I bet you if you're listening to this on either side, you probably wish it was different too. And it's easy for us to say, be vulnerable and talk about it.
True. Very true.
I don't know. And it might land where you don't have to talk about it. If you can get around it for right now, and kind of like the politics last week, if you can exist and respect one another, which is where I've landed. I try to just respect that and show love anyway. We don't dive into deep conversations, but I do not poke it. Maybe that's where you start, is just by stop poking it.
Right. And finding some common ground. You just said the other side. I had this visual of even last week with politics and religion, like we're putting me here, you there, or, us here, them there. Maybe we can just come and sit on the same side and find some common ground with religion, and just sit on the same side.
Even not with religion, with anything. I had a daughter-in-law here recently, and I don't know her very well. And the boys had gone to play golf, and she's married to one of the Eggers boys, and we had never had alone time ever. And I think one of my strengths is finding common ground. Like, people will make fun of me, I will keep at it until I find something we have in common that we can talk about.
So good.
And it was lovely to do that with her. I mean, it was hard because we are very different people, very different, but we both love pottery. If you notice me drinking coffee mugs, I love handmade pottery. I love blown glass, and she loved that. And so we found some things, and it was animals and plants. I mean, it kept going. There were more things. So like you said, Kari, maybe it's put religion on the side for a minute and just find any common ground, anything that can bring you to say, hey, we're not so different as you think. We both love our family. We both find things that you can agree on. Maybe you start there too. I mean, there are some other ways to get around. Hey, I listened to this podcast about religion, and so we should talk about it. Why do you hate God? Because I see you hate him.
A little abrupt.
Yeah, probably not the best approach for that.
Yeah.
Okay, what about when the differences are too big? Like, the conflict is just, you can't find common ground. You can't, for you, what your beliefs are and what the beliefs of your in-laws, they're so different, and there's no merging the two. Boundaries need to be set. And here's some ways that they can set boundaries without possibly being like, okay, you know what? They just don't exist to me anymore. cutting them out.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get to see the kids. They don't get to see their son. They're definitely not going to see me. I'm going to fix this problem and boom. Because, and again, with the memes, and we probably spend more time on TikTok and Reels and stuff than we should, but we don't have kids at home now. So we've got plenty of time to do that. But I know, right? We don't really.
Who has plenty of time?
None of us have any of that time. That is a complete lie. But I see all this stuff where it's like, hey, you know what? My mother-in-law is just, whatever. It's okay. Let's cut the grandparents out. Use the kids as kind of the grandparents to get to see them. And then when the grandparents behave, then we'll allow the kids back in. And some of that, I think, is
weaponizing.
Some of it hurts my heart. Some of it, some of it, it's legit.
Manipulation. Mm-hmm.
Right. Manipulation. Honestly, I unless there's something really huge going on, I think that the kids do benefit from knowing the grandparents, and the grandparents the same way. So I'll leave that there. I'm sure we'll get plenty of messages from angry mamas about their mother-in-law, but sometimes those differences are too big. What are some boundaries that can be set to keep both parties safe? Safe might be a strong word, but I think feeling-wise, it feels safe.
Yeah, I think one thing, it will require a conversation. It doesn't have to be in person. I would recommend I think a phone call listen, there's so much research on the power of communication. Face-to-face is still number one. Why is face-to-face number one? You can disarm quickly by seeing each other's reactions. You can really understand the tone. You can do that. But if that is too much for you, try a phone call. A phone call is second. A third would be a letter. But let me encourage you, one to try to never use is a text. I recently received a text from one of my children with an order to stop doing something, and I didn't take it very well. I quickly turned I didn't get defensive. I did a acquiesce and said, of course. But inside there was all kinds of what was behind that there. And I will have a conversation. I have not seen them face to face. At some point, I'm going to have a conversation with them about it when I see them again. It was odd. And I think if you are thinking about this, you're listening to this podcast and you're like, okay, I'm going to tell them right now, I'm going to set some boundaries. I'm about to shoot them a text and say, okay, you may not talk about church. You may not talk about Jesus. You may not talk about, the color blue, and you may not, because that offends me. Probably not going to be the most effective. So if you really are, before you cut her off or him off, be big enough to pick up the phone and say, do you have 5 minutes where I can share something with you? I think you got to do that before you got to do that. And you know what? If they say, nope, can't do it, they blow up, then you can make your decisions. But a text is not effective. There's no research that shows a text is an effective form of communication. Now, what do you think? Do you agree with that or not?
I absolutely agree. I feel like, that like I did in my 20s and 30s, thinking I knew all the things and I was this mature person. Picking up the phone and having that hard conversation shows that you are mature. A text, I feel like, is sometimes, depending on how you think she's going to respond, if it's a situation where you don't know how the person's going to respond, sometimes a text can be the right thing to do. But I feel like it's a cop-out sometimes. It's a cop-out. And so
it is for me when I use it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it absolutely is. I feel it. I know it. Like, I just don't want to. I don't want to have this conversation. Yeah. So in a situation like this, it's important. It's important if it's like the next step to cutting off the relationship, to pick up the phone, show maturity, and show that you're willing to do what it takes to, help the relationship. So I agree.
If you feel like you need to send a text, maybe your text should be, hey, I really feel we need to have a conversation about, church and the children going to church with you. When is a good time for me to give you a call? Because what that does is that prepares the other person that conversation is coming. So they have time to maybe think about it, diffuse a little bit, because we do know, depending on the person, there are some people, if you put something on them quickly, like I actually am one of those people. I do not, if someone brings something heavy to me, I don't often respond well in the moment. I get defensive quick, and now I will go back and settle and run back to you and apologize, because once I think about it and calm down. So I might have received a text. I had that particular child who texted me, said, hey, can you give me a call? I want to talk to you about something that bothered me. Well, then I would already be in the mindset of that's coming and maybe have been able to calm my nervous system before that started. So maybe that's an in-between that you could use. Yeah. What else, Alecia? We're winding down on time.
That's good. Yes. Yeah, I think that the biggest takeaway is empathy, right? On either sides.
Once again,
knowing where somebody is coming from. I did want to jump into this a little bit, and we can continue on another week if you think it's probably not. We're not going to continue another week. We already got the rest of the time planned out. But, one of those things that is, very, very different that for some people might be like difference is too big is I have a niece that was into witchcraft. I feel like that's a huge spiritual difference. If you have that going on in your family, and I have a great relationship with her. I love her. We obviously differ spiritually in what our beliefs are. But if that's your daughter-in-law or if that's your mother-in-law, like, what does that look like? Have y'all ever thought about, I don't know if you have any experience with people that you know or anything like that?
Well, I think if it's in the home, it's definitely boundaries. You have to set boundaries. Like we don't do that here.
Yeah.
But if it's outside the home and their own, like, again, it doesn't even matter what they're doing. It's just loving them where they're at. But I think if it was going on in the home, I'd have to set some boundaries.
And I mean, I don't study witchcraft, so I don't know what all's entailed, but I do know I have amethyst sitting in my bedroom, and there are people who believe that I do witchcraft because I have a crystal sitting in my bedroom. And there are people who've accused me of doing witchcraft because I believe I think the Enneagram is a great tool. I even think the horoscope, oh my gosh, is a tool. I don't think it's anything I live by that supersedes Jesus and God.
Right.
He is the ultimate for me, but I do have other things that people believe are of Satan in my home. So I sage my house after a heavy emotional time. There are things that I use that I think are tools of God, but other people see as witchcraft. I'm not saying I have no idea what your niece believes, but I'm just saying some of beliefs are subjective too. And again, I would agree with Kari. If you can set boundaries within your home, if it's your home, you can say, this is not welcome here. This is our home. Again, it all requires us being brave enough, if we're being honest, right, to have those conversations, to set the boundaries. I mean, it is tough. Now, one thing I will give the new generation coming up, they're better at that than we were. My kids are better at setting boundaries that I see than I was. And they are better at saying, this is not okay with me.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what? I can feel, I have a child who always says, I feel the way I feel. And I love that. That's years of therapy. And I love that. I feel the way I feel. And that is right. You do feel the way you feel. And so whatever that is, whatever you feel the way you feel. And if it's your home, you get the right to say, I don't know, just some things to add.
Yeah. No, I think I like, I think Kari, and you hit the nail on the head, right? Like, your home is a great place where you can set boundaries. In our house, we don't do that. And if you take my kids to your house, we don't do that in your house either. If you can't keep that boundary but that's like anything, right? Like, don't let them sleep in your bed. Don't give them all sorts of red dye and sugar. I mean, it kind of is an extension of one more of those things. If you can't follow the rules, then you don't get to play.
But it's also, I mean, we'll talk about this later because we definitely are running out of time. But, that's a hard one, because if you're the grandparent, you can easily say, but it's my house and we serve sugar with all the dyes at my house. We serve cookies. Mm-hmm. Like my daddy's favorites. He loved the Little Debbie snake. So this time of year, he would have, every Little Debbie snake around. So snack, Debbie cake, Little Debbie
Y'all
cake. Y'all
tune in next week we're going to talk about parenting. Parenting
styles.
Differences. For sure. That's going to be a good one. Well, I think, wrap it up. The biggest thing, again, comes empathy, trying to understand where that other person is coming from. And Kari, you said this a couple of podcasts ago, and it keeps coming up. Just giving other people grace to grow, right? Give them that space, right? Not everybody has everything figured out. In fact, not anybody has everything figured out. If they think they have it figured out, that's a pretty clear sign that they have some work to do. So anyway, I hope that this was helpful for y'all discussing it. We would love to hear from you guys. Any feedback that you guys have on any of this stuff, questions you have, issues you're dealing with. We love answering that stuff. So definitely hit us up. And we will see y'all next week, where Kathy is going to lead us through parenting style differences within the family.
So complicated.
Yeah.
So complicated.
Don't forget to make a small deposit this week.
And make a small deposit. Yes.
Yeah. Maybe make a sign that says, give grace to grow. I love that.
There you go.
Have a good week. Yeah. Thanks for listening.